Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now, please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. I've never been one to dismiss the unexplainable. Growing up with a mother who communicated with spirits shaped my perception of reality from an early age. My name isn't important, but what happened to me and my partner Milo in the spring of 2021 changed us forever. We live in a busy city in the South Midlands of England, a place where concrete gradually gives way to rolling countryside and ancient woodlands. Our flat sits on the third floor of a converted Victorian house, with large windows that flood the space with light during the day, but transform into black mirrors at night, reflecting our movements back at us with unsettling clarity. Milo is my opposite in many ways. While I embrace the possibility of worlds beyond our understanding, he approaches life through the lens of his biochemistry degree. Evidence, data, and logical explanations form the foundation of his worldview. There's always a rational explanation, he would say, whenever I'd mention the faint whispers I sometimes heard in our hallway or the sensation of being watched while alone. Despite our differences, we balance each other perfectly. Our American bully, Bruno, completed our small family. With his muscular build and intimidating appearance, strangers often crossed the street when they saw us approaching. What they failed to see was his gentle nature and his overwhelming desire to make friends with everyone he encountered. My mother, Grace, had always told me that certain people serve as beacons for supernatural entities. Your energy draws them, she explained during one of our weekly phone calls. The veil between worlds is thinner for some. You inherited that from me. I never gave her warnings much thought. The strange occurrences I'd experienced throughout my life, objects moving slightly from where I'd left them, the occasional unexplained footsteps or the fleeting shadows in my peripheral vision, had become so commonplace that I barely acknowledged them anymore. But what happened that spring afternoon in Oakley Park would force even Milo to question his firmly held beliefs about the nature of reality. Some experiences defy rational explanation, leaving us to confront the terrifying possibility that our understanding of the world is woefully incomplete. The morning of April 17, 2021 began like any other Saturday. The COVID restrictions had eased enough to allow outdoor gatherings, and people were eagerly reclaiming public spaces after months of isolation. Sunshine streamed through our kitchen window as Milo prepared breakfast. Bruno circled excitedly around our feet, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors. We should take Bruno to Oakley Park today, Milo suggested, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the counter to me. He needs a proper run, and the weather's perfect. I nodded in agreement. The sprawling park on the outskirts of the city was one of Bruno's favorite places. With its central lake, surrounding woodlands, and adjoining fields, Oakley offered ample space for him to explore without the judgment that often accompanied bringing a bully breed to more crowded areas. We could take the trail through the woods, I said between bites. It should be quieter there. By mid-morning, we had packed a small lunch, filled Bruno's water bottle, and driven the 15 minutes to the park. As expected, the main areas were teeming with families enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. Children screamed with laughter as they chased each other across the grass. Cyclists weaved between pedestrians on the paved paths, and the aroma of barbecues filled the air. We parked in the overflow lot and made our way toward the less populated northern section. Bruno tugged eagerly at his leash, his powerful body straining forward as if he sensed adventure awaiting us. "Easy, boy," Milo laughed, adjusting his grip. "We'll get there soon enough." The temperature climbed steadily as we walked, eventually settling at nearly 30 degrees Celsius, extraordinarily hot for an English spring. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I was grateful for the baseball cap I'd thrown on as an afterthought. Milo had stripped down to his t-shirt, tying his light jacket around his waist. "Remind me why we chose to go hiking on the hottest day of the year?" he joked, pausing to take a swig from his water bottle. "For Bruno," I replied. watching our dog pant happily as he investigated a cluster of dandelions, though I'm starting to question if it's worth the heat stroke. We continued along the main path until we reached the northern edge of the lake, where most visitors rarely ventured. A weathered wooden sign pointed toward a narrow dirt trail that disappeared between tall grass and eventually led to a cattle gate separating the park from the neighboring farmland. "This way," I said, leading us toward the gate. "Once we're through here, we can let Bruno off the leash." As we passed through the gate, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The sounds of the park, children's laughter, conversations, the splash of paddle boats on the lake remained audible, but seemed somehow distant, as if we'd stepped slightly out of sync with the world we'd left behind. I dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the sudden quiet and the change in terrain as we moved from manicured parkland to the wilder landscape beyond. The path narrowed further, winding between fields of tall grass before approaching a dense line of trees that marked the beginning of the wooded area. Bruno trotted happily ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure we were following. His ears perked forward, alert to the new sounds and smells that surrounded us. Milo walked beside me, his hand occasionally brushing against mine in a gesture of casual intimacy. "This is nice," he remarked, surveying the landscape. "We should come here more often." I nodded in agreement, taking in the beauty of our surroundings. The sky stretched endlessly above us, an uninterrupted expanse of brilliant blue without a single cloud to mar its perfection. The fields around us swayed gently, though I couldn't feel any breeze against my skin. That was the first discrepancy I noticed, movement without wind. A slight contradiction that my brain registered but didn't immediately process as significant. It was just one of many subtle wrongnesses that would accumulate over the next hour, gradually building toward a crescendo of horror that would change us forever. As we approached the tree line, the dirt path narrowed further, forcing us to walk single file with Bruno leading the way. The woods loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the open fields we'd been traversing. Even from a distance, I could see how densely packed the trees were, their canopies creating shadows that seemed unusually dark, given the brightness of the day. "The path loops through there and eventually brings us back around to the park," I explained, pointing toward where the trail disappeared between the trees. "Should take us about 40 minutes if we don't stop." Milo nodded, but I noticed he was squinting at something near the edge of the woods, approximately 50 meters to our right. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach tighten. A figure was moving through the underbrush, parallel to the tree line, but not on any visible path. Even at this distance, something about the person's movement seemed wrong, jerky and fluid simultaneously, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "He's coming from nowhere," I murmured, instinctively slowing my pace. The area beyond the woods consisted only of more woods and eventually private farmland. There were no roads, no houses, no reason for anyone to emerge from that direction. As we continued walking, I kept glancing toward the figure, who had now changed direction and appeared to be making his way toward the same path we were on. The closer he got, the more details became apparent, and the more my unease grew. He was tall, extraordinarily so, with a build that suggested both strength and awkwardness. His clothing seemed entirely inappropriate for the scorching weather. A thick black hoodie pulled up despite the heat, black pants, and what appeared to be heavy boots. Dirty blonde hair hung in lank strands around a face that was handsome in a conventional way, but twisted into an expression that made my skin crawl. A dazed, lopsided smile that never wavered. "Maybe he's looking for something?" Milo suggested, though his tone betrayed his own discomfort. "A dog that ran off, perhaps?" I tried to convince myself of the same, but the man wasn't calling out or whistling as one would when searching for a pet. He moved with purpose, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, that fixed smile never leaving his face. "Let's pick up the pace," I said quietly, tugging Bruno's leash to urge him forward. The dog, usually eager to investigate newcomers, was uncharacteristically compliant, matching our quickened stride without resistance. We reached the entrance to the wooded area and stepped onto the path that cut through it. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as soon as we passed beneath the canopy of leaves. a natural phenomenon that would normally bring relief from the heat, but now only added to my growing sense of wrongness. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw that the man had reached the main path. He was now following us, no more than 30 feet behind. His height was even more apparent now that we were on level ground. He had to be at least 6'9", possibly taller. His shoulders were broad, his arms too long for his torso, and he moved with that same swaying gait I'd noticed earlier, like someone trying to walk while severely intoxicated. It was then that I realized the sound had changed. The background noise of the park, which should have been audible even from this distance, had disappeared completely. No children's voices, no dogs barking, no ambient sounds of human activity. Even the natural sounds of the woodland were absent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no scurrying creatures in the underbrush. The only sound was a low, continuous whisper that resembled wind through trees, except there was no wind. The air was completely still, heavy with humidity and the scent of decaying vegetation. Milo had noticed it too. His face had gone pale, and he was gripping Bruno's leash so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Our dog, normally confident and curious, had positioned himself between us, his head lowered and ears flattened against his skull. "He's getting closer," Milo whispered, his voice tight with fear. I risked another backward glance and felt my breath catch in my throat. The man was indeed closer, much closer than he should have been given the pace at which we were walking. He was now perhaps 20 feet behind us, that unsettling smile still fixed on his face. His eyes, which I could now see clearly, seemed wrong somehow, too wide, too vacant, as if he was looking through us rather than at us. But what disturbed me most was the silence of his approach. Despite his size and the dry leaves that covered the path, he made no sound when he moved. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing to indicate that he was a physical presence rather than a hallucination we were somehow sharing. The quality of light had changed too. Though the sun still filtered through the leaves above, everything appeared desaturated, as if we were walking through an old photograph rather than reality. Colors seemed to bleed at the edges, and shadows fell in directions that contradicted the sun's position. "We need to get out of here," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Now." The path through the woods curved ahead, eventually leading to a section bordered by tall, dense hedgerows on both sides. If we could reach that point, we'd be closer to the main park area, closer to other people, closer to safety. Milo didn't need convincing. He quickened his pace, pulling Bruno along, who for once seemed eager to leave rather than explore. I followed closely, fighting the urge to run outright, knowing instinctively that showing fear might somehow make our situation worse. The strange pseudo-wind sound grew louder as we moved deeper into the woods. A continuous whisper that seemed to form words just beyond comprehension. The temperature continued to drop until I could see my breath forming small clouds despite the day's earlier heat. I forced myself to check behind us again. The man was now less than 15 feet away, moving with that same swaying gait, but somehow covering ground far more quickly than should have been possible. His smile had widened, stretching his face in a way that didn't seem anatomically feasible. "He's right behind us," I hissed to Milo, who had reached the curve in the path where it transitioned from woodland to the hedgerow corridor. "I know," Milo replied, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "I can feel him." That's when Bruno suddenly let out a low, rumbling growl, the first sound he'd made since we'd entered the woods. His hackles rose, and he stared not at the man behind us, but at something ahead on the path. I looked up and felt my heart skip several beats. Impossibly, the same man was also standing approximately 20 feet ahead of us, blocking our path forward. The exact same figure, same height, same clothes, same disturbing smile, was somehow both behind and in front of us simultaneously. "That's not possible," Milo breathed, his scientific mind visibly struggling to process what we were seeing. Bruno's growl deepened, and he began backing up, pressing against our legs as if trying to herd us away from both figures. The man ahead took a step toward us, and at the same moment, I felt a presence directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on the back of my neck, but there was nothing. Just an unnatural cold that seemed to penetrate through my clothes and into my bones. Instinct took over. I spun around, car keys clutched between my fingers as a makeshift weapon, ready to strike at whatever was there. But my hand met only empty air. There was nothing behind me. The path was empty in both directions. Both manifestations of the tall man had vanished completely. One moment threatening us from two directions, the next gone without a trace, without a sound, without disturbing a single leaf on the ground. In the sudden absence of threat, I became aware that the sounds of the park had returned. Birds chirped overhead, the distant laughter of children carried on the breeze, and the warm air of the spring day enveloped us once more. Colors returned to normal intensity, and the shadows aligned correctly with the sun's position. Milo and I stood frozen for several seconds, both struggling to process what had just happened. Bruno was the first to recover, his body relaxing as he looked up at us with what almost seemed like confusion. "Did you—" Milo started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Did you see that?" I nodded, unable to form words. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I lowered the keys I'd been clutching so tightly they'd left indentations in my palm. "We need to get back to the car," I finally managed to say. "Now." We practically ran the remainder of the path through the hedgerow corridor and back toward the main park area. Neither of us spoke, both too consumed by what we'd experienced to articulate our thoughts. Bruno trotted between us, occasionally glancing back the way we'd come, as if expecting pursuit. The park was exactly as we'd left it. Families enjoying the sunshine, couples lounging on blankets, children playing games on the grass. The normality of it all seemed surreal after what we'd just encountered. How could everything be so ordinary when our understanding of reality had just been shattered? We reached the car in record time, piling in with Bruno in the back seat. Milo's hands shook as he inserted the key into the ignition. "What the hell was that?" he finally asked, his voice barely steady. I had no answer for him. Despite growing up with a mother who claimed to communicate with spirits, despite my own occasional unexplained experiences, nothing had prepared me for what we'd just encountered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to talk to my mother." Grace's voice on the phone betrayed her concern as soon as I described what had happened. She asked detailed questions about the appearance of the man, the changes in the environment, and how we'd felt during the encounter. "This isn't a typical haunting," she said after I'd finished recounting our experience. "The ability to appear in two places simultaneously, the environmental changes, the effect on time and perception, these suggest something more powerful than a residual spirit." "Then what was it?" I asked, glancing at Milo, who sat beside me on our sofa, pretending not to listen too intently. Despite his skepticism, he'd been visibly shaken by what we'd witnessed. "I'm not entirely sure," my mother replied, her voice hesitant in a way that sent a chill through me. Grace was never uncertain when it came to supernatural matters. "But I think you should research the history of that area. Entities like the one you've described are often tied to locations where trauma occurred." After ending the call, I spent hours online researching Oakley Park and the surrounding woodland. What I discovered disturbed me further. Over the past 50 years, there had been an unusually high number of suicides and accidental deaths in the wooded area where we'd encountered the tall man. Most were attributed to drug overdoses or mental health crises, with victims seeking the seclusion of the woods for their final moments. One case from 2017 particularly caught my attention. A university student had gone missing after telling friends he was going for a walk in Oakley Park. His body was discovered 3 weeks later in the woods, the cause of death determined to be an overdose of prescription medication. According to the news reports, he was described as unusually tall and had been suffering from mental health issues exacerbated by the stress of his studies. I couldn't find a photograph, so I couldn't confirm if this was the same figure we'd seen, but the coincidence was unsettling. Milo remained quiet throughout my research, occasionally looking over my shoulder at the articles I'd found. I could sense his rational mind struggling to reconcile what he knew of the world with what he'd experienced. "You don't have to believe it," I said eventually, closing my laptop, "but you can't deny what we both saw." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I believe anymore. I just know that what happened wasn't normal, wasn't possible." That night, we both struggled to sleep. Every creak of the building, every shadow cast by passing car headlights, seemed threatening. Bruno refused to settle in his usual spot at the foot of our bed, instead positioning himself directly between us, his body tense as if standing guard. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and plagued by dreams of a tall figure watching from a distance, always smiling, always tilting his head at that unnatural angle. In my dreams he never approached, just observed with those vacant eyes that somehow conveyed both emptiness and malevolence. I woke frequently throughout the night, each time immediately scanning the darkened room for any sign of intrusion. By morning, both Milo and I were exhausted, our nerves frayed from the constant state of alertness. Maybe it was just a one-time thing, Milo suggested over coffee, his voice hopeful but unconvincing. A shared hallucination triggered by heat exhaustion or something. I wanted to believe him, wanted to dismiss what we'd seen as a momentary break from reality that would never repeat itself, but deep down I knew better. The encounter had felt too real, too specifically targeted at us. And something in me, the part that had grown up with a mother who spoke to the dead as casually as she spoke to the living, recognized that we had somehow attracted the attention of something that existed beyond the boundaries of natural law, something that had taken an interest in us, something that wasn't finished with us yet. For 3 days, we attempted to return to normal life. Milo went back to work at the research laboratory, while I continued my online course applications for the upcoming term. We walked Bruno in the local neighborhood, but avoided parks and wooded areas. We didn't discuss what had happened, as if by mutual agreement we'd decided that acknowledging it might somehow give it more power. On the 4th night, I awoke in the darkness, unsure what had disturbed my sleep. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:17 a.m., that dead hour of the night, when the world seems most removed from daylight rationality. The bedroom was dimly illuminated by the orange glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains, casting elongated shadows across the walls and ceiling. Milo slept soundly beside me, his breathing deep and regular. Bruno, however, was awake, his eyes reflecting the meager light as he stared fixedly at a point near the foot of our bed. I followed his gaze and felt my entire body go rigid with terror. He was there, standing motionless between the bed and the doorway. The tall man from the woods, his form even more imposing in the confined space of our bedroom. His head nearly touched the ceiling, and that same disturbing smile stretched across his face, made more grotesque by the orange light that carved harsh shadows into his features. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink as I stared at the impossible figure that had somehow manifested inside our locked apartment. He made no sound, no movement beyond a slight swaying, but his presence filled the room with an oppressive cold that seemed to radiate outward in palpable waves. His eyes, which had seemed vacant in the daylight, now appeared entirely black in the dim glow, like holes punctured in reality that opened onto absolute nothingness. They fixed on me with an intensity that suggested recognition, as if he had been searching specifically for me. Survival instinct finally overrode my paralysis. I lunged forward, arm outstretched to strike at the intruder, a scream building in my throat. My hand passed through empty air. Where the figure had stood just a second before, there was nothing. No sound of retreat, no disturbance of the air, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Just the lingering cold that gradually dissipated like morning mist. Milo jolted awake at my sudden movement, confusion clouding his features as he fumbled for the lamp switch. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "He was here," I gasped, still staring at the now empty space where the tall man had stood. "Right here in our bedroom, watching us sleep." Milo was immediately alert, switching on every light in the apartment as we searched every room, checking windows and doors that remained securely locked, looking under furniture and inside closets where no human, especially one of that height, could possibly hide. We found nothing, no evidence of intrusion, no explanation for what I'd seen. Bruno remained agitated, refusing to leave my side and growling softly whenever we approached certain areas of the apartment, particularly the corners where shadows gathered despite the lights. "Maybe it was a hypnagogic hallucination," Milo suggested gently after we'd confirmed we were alone. "They can seem incredibly real, especially when you're stressed or sleep-deprived. I wanted to believe him, to accept the rational explanation he offered. But Bruno's behavior told a different story. Our dog, who relied on senses far more acute than our own, was still responding to something in our apartment, something invisible to us, but undeniably present. He was here, I insisted, wrapping my arms around myself to ward off the lingering chill. And I think he's still here somehow. Not physically, but watching. Milo didn't argue further, likely recognizing the futility of debating perception versus reality at 4 a.m. Instead, he made tea and sat with me in the harshly lit kitchen until dawn broke, neither of us willing to return to the bedroom where something impossible had occurred. As daylight gradually filled the apartment, the immediate terror receded, replaced by a persistent unease that clung to us like a second skin. The physical manifestation might have vanished, but the sense of being observed remained, an awareness of attention focused on us from somewhere beyond normal perception. "We can't stay here tonight," I said finally, watching as Milo mechanically prepared breakfast neither of us had an appetite for. "I can't sleep here knowing he can appear whenever he wants." Milo nodded, his earlier skepticism apparently abandoned after a night of watching Bruno react to invisible stimuli around our home. "We'll go to a hotel," he agreed, "just for a night or two until we figure out what to do next." But deep down, I suspected that changing our location would make little difference. Whatever had found us in the woods, whatever had followed us home and manifested in our bedroom, wasn't constrained by physical boundaries or normal limitations of space. It had chosen us for reasons I couldn't comprehend, and I feared that distance alone wouldn't be enough to break the connection it had established. The hotel provided only temporary relief. We stayed for 2 nights, sleeping fitfully despite the neutral, impersonal surroundings that should have felt free from the presence that had invaded our home. Bruno remained vigilant, occasionally growling at empty corners or staring intently at blank walls as if tracking something invisible to human eyes. When we returned to our apartment, the sense of wrongness had intensified. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the physical laws that governed reality had been subtly altered within our living space. Objects weren't where we'd left them, nothing dramatic, just small displacements that could almost be attributed to memory lapses, if not for their consistency. Milo's watch, always left on his nightstand, would appear on the kitchen counter. My textbooks would shift positions on the shelf overnight. Bruno's toys would move from their basket to the middle of rooms we hadn't entered. Then the sounds began. Late at night, when the building around us had settled into silence, we would hear footsteps overhead. Heavy, measured steps that crossed from one side of the ceiling to the other, despite the fact that our apartment was on the top floor with only an inaccessible attic space above us. An attic too small for anyone to stand upright in, let alone pace. Sometimes we would hear voices, whispered conversations that seemed to emanate from inside the walls, too faint to discern words, but clear enough to recognize cadence and tone. Occasionally, the voices would include what sounded like my own, calling Milo's name from another room when I was sitting right beside him. "I've heard of psychological contagion," Milo said one evening after we'd both distinctly heard a door slam in our hallway, despite all doors being open. "When one person experiences something traumatic, others close to them can begin to share in the experience through suggestion and heightened awareness." I appreciated his continued attempts to find rational explanations, but even he seemed unconvinced by his own theories. The experiences were too consistent, too shared between us, and too clearly affecting Bruno, who couldn't possibly be influenced by psychological suggestion. Our dog had developed new habits that broke my heart to witness. He refused to enter certain rooms alone, particularly our bedroom and the small study where I worked on my applications. He would no longer sleep at night, instead positioning himself at the foot of our bed in a sitting position, head turning slowly as he tracked movement only he could perceive. During the day, he would abruptly stop and stare at empty spaces, his body tense and hackles raised, sometimes backing away with a low growl, other times whimpering as if in submission. He was responding to something or someone that remained just beyond the threshold of human perception. "We need help," I finally admitted, after a particularly disturbing night when we'd both been awakened by what sounded like someone dragging something heavy across our living room floor. Professional help. Milo didn't argue, which told me just how seriously he was taking the situation. A month earlier, he would have scoffed at the idea of consulting a paranormal investigator or medium. Now he simply nodded, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. I contacted several paranormal investigation teams, but most were either booked months in advance or dismissed our experiences as typical house settling or overactive imaginations. One investigator agreed to visit, equipped with EMF meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders. He spent 6 hours in our apartment, during which time nothing unusual occurred. No footsteps, no voices, no moved objects. Sometimes entities go quiet when strangers are present, he explained apologetically as he packed up his equipment, but I'll analyze the data and see if anything was captured that you didn't notice. The analysis yielded nothing conclusive. Some unexplained temperature fluctuations in our bedroom, a few audio anomalies that might have been voices or might have been ambient noise from outside. Nothing that would convince a skeptic, nothing that explained what we were experiencing. As May turned to June, the manifestations intensified. The tall figure began appearing more frequently, glimpsed in reflective surfaces, standing at the end of hallways that would be empty when we turned to look directly, watching from outside windows on the 3rd floor where no one could possibly stand. Each appearance was brief, just long enough to register before vanishing, but the cumulative effect was devastating to our sense of security and well-being. We were constantly on edge, jumping at shadows, unable to relax even for a moment in what should have been the safety of our own home. Sleep became nearly impossible. When exhaustion finally forced us into unconsciousness, our dreams were invaded by the same figure, always watching, always smiling, always just out of reach. I would wake gasping for breath, certain I had felt cold fingers brush against my face in the darkness. Milo began documenting everything, partly as a coping mechanism, partly in an attempt to establish patterns that might help us understand what was happening. He created spreadsheets tracking the time and location of each manifestation, the environmental conditions, our emotional states, anything that might provide insight into the seemingly random occurrences. There's a correlation with time, he noted after 2 weeks of data collection. Activity peaks between 3 hours and 4 hours a.m. and again around sunset. Classic liminal periods when the boundary between day and night is blurring. It was the first time he'd used terminology that acknowledged the supernatural nature of our experiences rather than searching for scientific explanations. I recognized it as a significant shift in his worldview, one forced upon him by circumstances that defied rational understanding. We were both changing, both adapting to a reality where the impossible had become routine. But adaptation came at a cost. Dark circles under our eyes, weight loss, strained relationships with friends who couldn't understand why we'd become withdrawn and anxious. The breaking point came in early July, nearly 3 months after our encounter in the woods. I was alone in the apartment, Milo having reluctantly left for an important meeting at work that he couldn't miss despite our mutual fear of separation. I was sitting at the kitchen table, Bruno at my feet, when I heard my name called from the hallway. Not in Milo's voice, not in any human voice, but in a distorted approximation that raised the hairs on my arms and sent ice through my veins. Before I could react, every cabinet door in the kitchen flew open simultaneously, slamming against their hinges with such force that several glasses fell and shattered on the floor. Bruno began barking frantically, backing toward the wall as his eyes tracked something moving around the room. And then I saw him, the tall man, standing in the doorway, his head tilted at that impossible angle, his smile wider than any human mouth could stretch. But this time he didn't vanish when I looked directly at him. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements jerky yet fluid, like a glitch in reality. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even scream as he approached. The temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the suddenly freezing air. Bruno's barks turned to whimpers, and he pressed himself against my legs, trembling violently. The tall man stopped just short of touching distance, looming over me with that fixed, dazed expression. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't just vacant. they were wrong somehow, as if what looked out through them wasn't human and never had been. He raised one hand, unnaturally long fingers reaching toward my face. I felt the cold radiating from him, an absolute cold that seemed to leach the very heat from my cells. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. His head tilted further, the angle defying anatomical possibility. His mouth opened, wider and wider, revealing rows of teeth too numerous, too sharp to belong in a human mouth. No sound emerged, but I felt rather than heard a response that reverberated through my mind. "You." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember grabbing Bruno and running from the apartment. I don't remember the concerned neighbors who found me huddled in the stairwell, hyperventilating and incoherent. I only remember the absolute certainty that if I had remained in that kitchen a moment longer, something irreversible would have happened. Something that would have destroyed me in ways beyond physical harm. When Milo returned and found me being treated for shock by paramedics outside our building, we both knew we couldn't spend another night in that apartment. We moved out the next day, taking only essential belongings and Bruno. Milo's parents lived in Cornwall, nearly 300 miles away, and they welcomed us without question when we appeared on their doorstep, exhausted and traumatized but unwilling to explain exactly what had driven us from our home. The distance helped. The manifestations diminished in both frequency and intensity. We occasionally heard unexplained sounds or glimpsed movement in peripheral vision, but the tall man himself did not appear in the solid, terrifying form he had taken in our apartment. Bruno gradually returned to his normal behavior, though he still refused to sleep at night, maintaining his vigilant watch as if expecting the intrusions to resume at any moment. Perhaps he knew something we didn't, sensed that the reprieve was temporary rather than permanent. We stayed with Milo's parents for 2 months before finding a small cottage to rent in a nearby village. The property was old but bright, situated in a close-knit community where neighbors checked on each other, and privacy was a relative concept. After what we'd experienced, the lack of isolation felt comforting rather than intrusive. Slowly, we rebuilt our lives. Milo transferred to a local branch of his company, and I enrolled in courses at a nearby college. We established new routines, made new friends, created new spaces that weren't tainted by memory or fear. But the experience had changed us fundamentally. Milo's unwavering faith in science and rationality had been shattered, replaced by a more nuanced understanding that acknowledged the limits of human knowledge. My casual acceptance of the paranormal had deepened into profound respect for forces beyond our comprehension and caution regarding interaction with them. We never returned to Oakley Park, never sought answers about who or what the tall man had been. Some questions are better left unasked, some knowledge better left unacquired. We had glimpsed something beyond the veil of ordinary reality, something that had reached back and touched our lives in ways we still didn't fully understand. Occasionally, usually around 3 a.m. when the world is at its quietest, I wake with the certainty that I'm being watched. In those moments, I feel a connection stretching across the miles, a thin thread of awareness linking me to whatever had manifested in our old apartment. It hasn't forgotten us. I don't think it ever will. Bruno seems to sense these moments. He'll lift his head from his position at the foot of our bed, eyes alert, body tense as he stares into corners where shadows gather, despite the nightlight we now keep constantly burning. Sometimes he growls softly, a warning to something only he can perceive. Milo says I'm imagining things, that we're safe now, that whatever happened is behind us. But I notice he doesn't sleep during those pre-dawn hours either, his body artificially still in a pretense of slumber that doesn't fool me. He feels it too, the lingering attention from something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear. I've spoken with my mother about it multiple times. She believes we encountered something ancient, something that has existed in that woodland for centuries, occasionally taking forms that allow it to interact with the human world. She thinks it was drawn to me because of my inherited sensitivity, my openness to the unseen. Some entities feed on fear, she explained during one of our conversations. Others feed on awareness itself, The simple acknowledgement of their existence gives them strength. So by noticing it, by seeing it, we made it stronger? I asked, disturbed by the implication. Possibly, she conceded. Or perhaps you simply became visible to it in a way most people aren't. Either way, distance is your best protection. That, and refusing to engage. We followed her advice, building a life that focuses firmly on the physical world, on tangible connections and measurable realities. We rarely discuss what happened, rarely acknowledge the subtle wrongnesses that still occasionally manifest around us. Objects slightly displaced, cold spots in otherwise warm rooms, the sensation of being observed when we're supposedly alone. But sometimes, in those liminal moments between wakefulness and sleep, I find myself wondering if we ever truly escaped. If the tall man, or whatever wore that form, is still watching, still waiting, still smiling that dazed, disturbing smile as it bides its time. And in those moments, I reach for Milo's hand in the darkness, draw Bruno closer, and remind myself that whatever exists beyond our understanding, whatever reached out and touched our lives so profoundly, we faced it together and survived. That has to be enough, because the alternative, that our escape was merely temporary, that the distance we've placed between ourselves and Oakley Park is meaningless against something that doesn't obey the laws of physics or rationality, is too terrifying to contemplate. So we continue forward, building new memories to overlay the old, finding joy in ordinary moments, appreciating the simple blessing of a night without visitations or a day without inexplicable occurrences. And if sometimes I still hear footsteps overhead in a house with no upper floor, if sometimes I catch a glimpse of something impossibly tall standing in doorways or reflected in windows, I've learned to look away, to deny it the acknowledgement it seems to crave. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some encounters are better left in the past, and some doors once opened can never be fully closed again. We can only hope to keep what lies beyond them at bay through distance, through denial, and through the desperate hope that eventually it will lose interest and turn its attention elsewhere. But deep down, I know better. Whatever found us in those woods hasn't forgotten. It's patient. It's persistent. And somewhere in a place just beyond the reach of ordinary perception, it's still smiling. I got my first job when I was around 17 years old, at a dry cleaner in the middle of downtown Ogden, Utah. It was 2018, and I was eager to earn some money of my own. The brick building was wedged between two other shops on a long stretch of road that had seen better days. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another business on a street full of them. For the most part, the job was a quiet one. Customers would come in to pick up their clothes or drop off items to be cleaned. I would jot down their order, take the clothes to the back, tag each one, and sort them into bins. The store was rarely busy, and the customers were almost always nice. The work was simple, repetitive, and exactly what I needed to save up for college. The building itself was unremarkable at first glance, a narrow storefront with large display windows that allowed passers-by to see inside. The front area where customers entered was constructed entirely of glass, with two long desks positioned just in front of a half wall separating the customer area from the workspace. The space felt cramped but functional, with the scent of cleaning chemicals and pressed fabric hanging permanently in the air. Behind that divider was where I spent most of my time. The main room housed ironing machines, clothing racks, and completed bundles ready for pickup. The rhythmic hiss of steam presses and the mechanical whir of the conveyor racks provided a constant soundtrack to my shifts. My managers, I'll call them Richard and Joe for privacy, were brothers in their 60s who had inherited the business from their parents. They were kind, easygoing men with weathered hands and permanent wrinkles around their eyes from decades of smiling. Their parents, both well into their 80s, visited frequently, shuffling through the front door with treats for the staff and stories from when they'd first opened the place in the 1970s. A few other employees worked the earlier shifts, handling the bulk of the pressing and packaging. Because I was in high school, I took the evening shift, which ran from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Richard and Joe typically left around 5 p.m., leaving me alone in the store for the final hour. I didn't mind, being naturally introverted. I preferred working by myself. We had a direct line to the police station just down the road, and it was generally a safe area despite being near downtown. It wasn't until I'd been working there for a few weeks that I began to understand the full layout of the building and its peculiarities. If you went straight back from the main room, you'd find a small break room with a refrigerator, microwave, and a bathroom. A door there led out to the back parking lot where Richard and Joe parked their delivery van. Adjacent to this back room was the boiler room. This area was, to put it mildly, concerning. The flooring was incomplete, with sections missing entirely. To access the main power valve, you had to balance across a rickety wooden beam placed over a gaping hole in the floor. Looking back now, it absolutely violated every workplace safety regulation imaginable. But at the time, it was just another quirk of an old building. Then there was the washing room. This room branched off from the main area and was entirely made of concrete, with a large metal grate in the center of the floor. The industrial washing and drying machines dominated the space, along with miscellaneous equipment and supplies that didn't fit elsewhere. This room was always dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long shadows across the gray walls. The temperature in there remained consistently cold, regardless of the season, and the metal grate in the floor did nothing to help the ambiance. According to Richard, it led to the building's drainage system, but its presence felt ominous, like it was concealing something beneath. I didn't have to spend much time in the washing room, thankfully. My station was directly behind the half wall that separated the front from the back. But sometimes, when retrieving certain items or supplies, I'd have to venture into that cold, concrete space. Each time I found myself hurrying to complete whatever task had brought me there, eager to return to the relative warmth and light of the main floor. Being the last one there each evening meant I was responsible for locking up. The process involved shutting down the boiler, turning off all the equipment, and making sure everything was secure before leaving. The most nerve-wracking part was having to balance across that wooden beam in the boiler room to shut off the main valve, then navigating back through the darkening building to the front door. In winter, when darkness fell early, the final walkthrough was particularly unsettling. I developed a routine: shut down the machines, check the back door, turn off the lights in the break room, make my way through the main area, flick off those lights, and then sprint to the front door in near total darkness. The washing room, with its gaping metal grate and perpetual chill, would loom as an even darker void at the edge of my vision. I tried not to look at it as I passed. This was just how things were for the first few months. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary beyond the building's obvious quirks and my own overactive imagination. But that was about to change. It started subtly, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in November. I'd been working at the dry cleaner for nearly 3 months and had settled into a comfortable routine. The initial nervousness about being alone in the building had faded, replaced by the confidence that comes with familiarity. Richard and Joe had left for the day around 4:30, earlier than usual due to a family dinner. I was alone in the store, tagging a pile of dress shirts that had come in that afternoon. The radio played softly in the background. Richard always tuned it to a classic rock station before leaving, and I worked methodically, pinning small paper tags to each garment. The bell above the door jingled, startling me slightly. A middle-aged woman entered, looking for a suit she'd dropped off the previous week. I checked the computer, found her order number, and located her items on the rack of completed orders. After she paid and left, I returned to my tagging station behind the half wall. I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was different. The clothing rack I'd been using, a metal stand with an adjustable height pole, had changed. Before I'd gone to help the customer, the pole had been at my eye level, where I always kept it. Now it was fully extended, reaching almost to the ceiling, at least a foot above my head. A chill ran over my skin as I stared at it. To extend the pole, someone would have to step on the foot pedal at the base of the stand, which released the locking mechanism. Even if the pedal had somehow been triggered accidentally, the pole would have slammed down, not shot upward. And I was certain no one else was in the building. I would have heard the door chime if anyone had entered, and the back door was locked from the inside. I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see someone hiding behind the clothing racks or lurking near the dark entrance to the washing room, but there was no one. The building was silent except for the low hum of the heating system and Fleetwood Mac playing faintly on the radio. With shaking hands, I stepped on the foot pedal and lowered the pole back to its proper height. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the locking mechanism was faulty. Maybe there was some weird air pressure thing happening with the ventilation system. Maybe I'd left it higher than I remembered. None of these explanations felt satisfying, but I forced myself to accept them. I still had another hour left on my shift, and I couldn't afford to let my imagination run wild. I continued working, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder or peer into the darkened corners of the main room. The washing room, with its grate in the floor and perpetual dimness, seemed especially threatening. I avoided looking in that direction for the rest of my shift. Nothing else unusual happened that night. When 6 p.m. finally arrived, I rushed through the closing procedures faster than usual, nearly tripping as I hurried across the beam in the boiler room. I locked the front door with relief and practically ran to my car. As I drove home, I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for what had happened with the clothing rack. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd almost succeeded in dismissing the incident entirely. Almost. For several weeks after the clothing rack incident, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. The days grew shorter as winter settled in, and I grew accustomed to leaving work in complete darkness. The closing routine became second nature. Shut down the equipment, check the rooms, turn off the lights, and make my way to the front door. I still felt a persistent unease whenever I was alone in the building, particularly during that final hour after Richard and Joe had left. I found myself avoiding the washing room whenever possible and completing my tasks with increasing efficiency so I could leave on time, or even a few minutes early if I could manage it. December brought more customers as people prepared their formal wear for holiday parties. The increased workload kept me busy, and I had less time to dwell on my lingering unease. Richard and Joe hired a seasonal employee, an older woman named Gail, to help with the morning rush, but the evening shift remained mine alone. It was mid-December, about a week before my school's winter break, when the second incident occurred. The day had been ordinary, customers coming and going, clothes being processed, the usual routine. Richard and Joe had left at their usual time, around 5 p.m., with cheerful goodbyes and reminders about locking up properly. I had just finished hanging a batch of clean dress shirts on the delivery rack when it happened. Without warning or build-up, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't the normal anxiety I sometimes felt when alone in the building. This was something different, something crushing and immediate. My heart began to race and my palms grew sweaty. I felt as though someone was standing directly behind me, their breath on my neck, though when I spun around there was nobody there. The sensation was so intense that I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. There was no logical reason for this feeling. Nothing had changed in the building. No strange noises, no movement in my peripheral vision, no drop in temperature. Just this sudden, consuming dread that seemed to come from nowhere. And yet, I knew with absolute certainty that I was not alone. My eyes were drawn to the washing room. The single bulb that illuminated the space seemed dimmer than usual, barely penetrating the darkness beyond the doorway. Though I couldn't see anything unusual, I knew that whatever was causing this feeling of dread was in that room, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at the doorway. Each time I tried, my eyes would slide away, focusing instead on the floor, the wall, the clothing racks, anything but that dark opening. It was as though my mind was protecting me from seeing something it knew I couldn't handle. The feeling persisted, growing more intense with each passing minute. The air in the building felt thick, difficult to breathe. The normal sounds of the heating system and the occasional settling of the old structure seemed muffled, as though something was dampening them. After 20 minutes of this unbearable tension, I couldn't take it anymore. My shift wasn't due to end for another 40 minutes, but I decided to leave early. I hurriedly shut down the equipment, not bothering with my usual thorough check of the rooms. I couldn't bring myself to enter the boiler room to shut off the main valve. Richard would have to forgive me for skipping that step just this once. I grabbed my coat and bag, turned off the main lights, and practically ran to the front door. As I fumbled with the keys, trying to lock up with trembling hands, I felt the presence behind me grow stronger, as though it had followed me from the washing room. Finally, the door locked, and I rushed to my car, not looking back at the building. As I drove away, the feeling of dread began to dissipate, replaced by embarrassment at my reaction. By the time I reached home, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd experienced some kind of panic attack, possibly brought on by final stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had been in that building with me, something that didn't want me there. The next day at school, still rattled by the previous evening's experience, I decided to do some research. During my lunch break, I headed to the library and accessed the local history archives on one of the computers. If something strange was happening at the dry cleaner, perhaps the building's past might offer some clues. What I discovered was fascinating. Ogden had once been known as Junction City due to its position as a major railroad hub. During Prohibition from 1920 to 1933, the downtown area had thrived with illegal activities: bootlegging, gambling, and speakeasies. A network of tunnels had been constructed beneath the streets, allowing for the discreet movement of alcohol and other contraband. The area where the dry cleaner now stood had once housed a succession of businesses: a hardware store in the 1940s, a pawn shop in the 1950s, and briefly a doctor's office in the 1960s, before Richard and Joe's parents had purchased it in the early 1970s. Nothing in the building's known history immediately suggested a reason for supernatural activity. But the tunnels beneath downtown Ogden captured my attention. According to the archives, many of these passages remained intact, though sealed off from public access. Could one of these tunnels run beneath the dry cleaner? Could the metal grate in the washing room floor be connected to this underground network? One newspaper article from 1928 mentioned a police raid on a speakeasy near the current intersection of 25th and Washington, exactly where the dry cleaner stood. 3 people had died in the ensuing gunfight, 2 patrons and a young woman who worked there. The article didn't specify the exact location, but it was close enough to be concerning. I printed several pages of historical information and continued my research that evening at home. Online forums dedicated to Ogden's history mentioned countless stories of hauntings throughout the downtown area. Most were typical ghost stories: strange noises, items moving, shadowy figures. None specifically mentioned the dry cleaner building, but several described similar experiences in nearby structures. The next day at work, I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to catch Richard or Joe alone so I could ask about the building's history without seeming strange. Richard was in the back preparing the delivery orders when I arrived. "Morning," he greeted me cheerfully. "You're in early today." "Yeah," I replied, hanging up my coat. "I actually wanted to ask you something." Richard looked up from his clipboard. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, then decided on a slightly indirect approach. "I was doing a history project for school about Ogden during Prohibition, and I read about all these tunnels downtown. I was wondering if you knew if there are any under this building." Richard's expression changed slightly. Not quite concern, but a certain wariness entered his eyes. "Funny you should ask about that. When my parents bought this place, the previous owner mentioned something about a sealed passage in the basement." "Basement?" I echoed. "I didn't know we had a basement." Richard nodded toward the washing room. "That grate in the floor. It's not just for drainage. There's a small space underneath, maybe 6 feet deep. Not a full basement, but enough room for the original plumbing systems. Dad used to go down there to do repairs." My stomach tightened. Is there a way to access it?" "The grate lifts up," Richard said, "but it's heavy, and there's nothing down there now except pipes and probably decades of dust." "Why the interest?" I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just curious about the building's history." Richard seemed to consider something for a moment, then said, "This building's been here since the 1890s, you know. It's seen a lot. Dad used to say he felt like he wasn't alone sometimes when he worked late." He chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Old buildings make noises. They have character. Have you ever experienced anything unusual here?" I ventured. Richard busied himself with the delivery orders again. "Nothing worth mentioning. Just old pipes and settling foundations." He glanced at his watch. "Joe will be here soon with the morning load. Better get ready for opening." The conversation was clearly over, but Richard had told me enough. The building had a history, and I wasn't the first person to sense something unusual within its walls. The knowledge was both validating and unsettling. That day, I couldn't stop thinking about the space beneath the washing room floor. What was really down there? Was it connected to the tunnel system? And most disturbing of all, was that where the presence I'd felt was coming from? For the next few shifts, I was hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow in the building. The washing room became a place of particular dread. I'd hurry through any tasks that required me to enter it, and I couldn't help staring at the metal grate each time, wondering what lay beneath. Richard's revelation about the space below had given physical form to my fears. No longer was it just a vague sense of unease. Now there was a specific location, a potential source for the disturbances I'd experienced. I debated whether to share my experiences with Richard and Joe. They clearly knew more about the building's history than they'd initially let on, but I hesitated to appear superstitious or, worse, unable to handle the job. I needed the work, and good positions for high school students were hard to come by in our area. So I said nothing and continued my shifts as normally as possible. December turned to January, and with the new year came a severe cold snap. Temperatures plunged below freezing, and the old building's heating system struggled to keep up. The washing room, always cold, became practically frigid. It was during this cold spell, about a week after New Year's, that I had my third encounter. The one that would leave me with physical evidence I couldn't explain away. The day had been particularly busy. A pipe had burst in an apartment building nearby, and we'd received an influx of water-damaged garments that needed urgent attention. Richard and Joe had stayed later than usual to help process everything, finally leaving around 5:30. I had only 30 minutes left on my shift and I was exhausted. As I was sorting the last batch of clothes, I heard a sound from the washing room, a metallic scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, followed by a dull thud. My immediate thought was that a rat or some other small animal had gotten into the building, seeking warmth. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. The temperatures outside were brutal, and older buildings like ours weren't exactly airtight. Still, I approached the washing room with caution, flicking on the additional light we sometimes used when doing detailed work. The extra illumination helped, but the corners remained shadowed, and the metal grate in the center of the floor seemed darker somehow, as though the light couldn't quite reach it. I saw nothing unusual. No animals, no fallen equipment, nothing that could have made the sounds I'd heard. Just as I was about to leave, the light above me flickered, and in that momentary darkness, I thought I saw movement near the grate. A subtle shifting, as though something were pressing against it from below. When the light stabilized, there was nothing there. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. I backed out of the room quickly, nearly tripping over a laundry bin in my haste. For the remaining 20 minutes of my shift, I stayed as far from the washing room as possible, keeping it in my peripheral vision while I worked. No more sounds came from that direction, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. When it was time to leave, I performed the closing routine in record time, skipping steps and rushing through the building with reckless speed. I didn't even bother to turn off the main valve in the boiler room. I couldn't face the thought of balancing on that wooden beam with my back to the washing room. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with my keys in the bitter cold. As I slid into the driver's seat and turned on the ignition, the headlights illuminated the front of the building. That's when I noticed something on my windshield, 2 distinct marks on the upper corner of the passenger side. At first, I thought it was dirt, or maybe ice crystals forming in the extreme cold. But when I looked closer, I saw they were perfectly formed prints, like those of a bird, but larger and more defined than any bird I'd ever seen. They resembled chicken feet, but were too large, each print about the size of my palm. I turned on the wipers, expecting the marks to clear away with the windshield fluid. They didn't budge. I got out and examined them more closely. They appeared to be pressed into the glass itself, as though something with incredible force had left its impression. I touched one of the prints cautiously. The glass was ice cold, but the area within the print felt even colder, almost burning my fingertip on contact. I yanked my hand back, then quickly got back into the car and drove home, unnerved by what I'd discovered. The next morning, in daylight, I examined the prints again. They were still there, exactly as I'd seen them the night before. Two perfect impressions of what looked like avian feet, but wrong somehow. The toes too long and curved. The overall shape subtly disturbing. I tried everything to remove them. Glass cleaner, rubbing alcohol, even a razor blade. Nothing worked. The prints remained, as though they were part of the glass itself. My parents noticed them later that week, and were equally puzzled. We eventually dubbed them the weird bird prints, and tried to ignore them, though I knew they were connected to whatever haunted the dry cleaner. Those prints stayed on my windshield for years until my car finally died in a Walmart parking lot 3 years later, and was sold for scrap. Even then, as the tow truck pulled it away, I could still see those marks catching the light, a permanent reminder of what I'd experienced. After the incident with the prints on my windshield, I seriously considered quitting my job. The experiences were becoming more frequent, more intrusive, and now I had physical evidence that something truly unexplainable was happening. But January was a slow month for job hunting, and I still needed the income for college savings. So I stayed, but I made changes. I asked to switch my schedule so I wouldn't be the last person in the building. Richard seemed surprised by the request, but agreed to adjust the hours so that either he or Joe would close up most evenings. I didn't offer a full explanation, just mentioned feeling uncomfortable being alone downtown after dark. It wasn't entirely a lie. On the days when I did have to close, I asked if a friend could pick me up directly from the shop. Having someone waiting outside made the final walkthrough less terrifying, knowing I wouldn't be alone in the parking lot. These adjustments helped, but my curiosity about what was happening wouldn't let me rest. The metal grate in the washing room floor haunted my thoughts. What was really down there? Was it connected to the old tunnels? And most importantly, was it the source of the disturbances? I knew I should leave it alone. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed that investigating further was a terrible idea. But I needed answers, something concrete to either confirm my fears or put them to rest. One afternoon in late January, I finally got my chance. Richard had to leave early for a doctor's appointment, and Joe was making deliveries. The seasonal employee, Gail, had finished her shift at noon. I would have about 20 minutes completely alone in the building before Joe returned. As soon as Richard's car pulled out of the parking lot, I headed straight for the washing room. The single bulb cast its weak light across the concrete floor as I approached the metal grate with determined steps. I'd brought a flashlight from home, tucked in my back pocket for this exact purpose. The grate was heavy, about 3 feet square and made of thick industrial metal. I'd never tried to move it before, but Richard had mentioned it could be lifted. I found small handholds on 2 sides and pulled upward with all my strength. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a grating sound that set my teeth on edge, it began to move. The smell hit me first, damp earth and old stone, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of decades without fresh air. As I set the grate aside, the opening yawned before me, a square of perfect darkness that seemed to swallow the washing room's meager light. I took out my flashlight and clicked it on, pointing the beam downward. A short metal ladder was attached to one wall of the shaft, leading down about 8 feet to a concrete floor. Pipes ran along one wall, the building's plumbing system, just as Richard had said. But what he hadn't mentioned was the narrow passage that extended from the small chamber, disappearing into darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. My heart pounded as I considered my options. Joe would be back soon. If I was going to investigate, it had to be now. Common sense told me to replace the grate and forget what I'd seen. But the need to know, to understand what had been happening, overrode my caution. I swung my legs over the edge and carefully descended the ladder. The air grew colder with each step down, until my breath fogged in front of me when I reached the bottom. The small chamber was about 6 feet square, with the plumbing pipes along one wall and the mysterious passage opening on the opposite side. I directed my flashlight into the passage. It was narrow. I would have to crouch to enter it, and the walls were old brick, discolored with age and moisture. The floor was packed earth, and it sloped gently downward, leading away from the building. This had to be one of the Prohibition-era tunnels I'd read about. It probably connected to other buildings on the block, maybe even to the larger network that had once run beneath much of downtown Ogden. I took a tentative step toward the passage, then stopped as a sound reached my ears. A soft shuffling, like fabric brushing against brick, coming from somewhere within the tunnel. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound came again, slightly closer this time. Every instinct screamed at me to climb back up the ladder, but I found myself frozen in place, flashlight aimed at the dark opening. The beam caught something, a movement in the shadows, just beyond where the light could fully penetrate. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw the outline of a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, with a shape that wasn't quite human. Then it was gone, retreating further into the darkness with that same soft shuffling sound. That broke my paralysis. I scrambled up the ladder so quickly I scraped my shin on one of the metal rungs. I didn't feel the pain until later. At the top, I heaved the grate back into place with strength born of pure adrenaline, then backed away until I hit the washing machine behind me. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the grate as though expecting something to force its way through at any moment. Nothing happened. The washing room remained silent except for the distant hum of the heating system and my own ragged breathing. The sound of the front door opening made me jump. Joe had returned. I quickly composed myself and left the washing room, closing the door firmly behind me. Joe greeted me cheerfully, unaware of what had just transpired. I worked through the rest of my shift in a daze, mechanically performing my tasks while my mind replayed what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in the tunnel. Had there really been a figure in the darkness, or was it a trick of light and shadow, combined with my already heightened state of fear? One thing was certain, I wouldn't be going back down there. Whatever secrets lay beneath the dry cleaner would remain buried, at least as far as I was concerned. February arrived with heavy snowfall and continued cold. I maintained my new schedule, rarely closing the shop alone, and when I did, I made sure someone was waiting for me outside. The strange incident seemed to subside. No more feelings of dread, no mysterious movements, no sounds from the washing room. I began to wonder if my brief venture into the space below had somehow appeased whatever presence haunted the building. Perhaps acknowledging its existence had been enough. Or maybe the extreme cold had temporarily suppressed the supernatural activity, like animals hibernating through winter. Whatever the reason, I welcomed the respite. My final semester of high school was demanding enough without the added stress of unexplained phenomena. I settled back into the routine of the dry cleaner, focusing on my work and trying to put the experiences behind me. Then, in mid-February, something happened that brought it all rushing back. An elderly man came into the shop one afternoon looking for Richard or Joe. I explained that they were both out on deliveries but would return shortly. The man, who introduced himself as Harold, decided to wait. He was in his 80s at least, with thinning white hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who had once been tall but was now compressed by age. "You work here long?" he asked, as he settled into one of the chairs in the waiting area. "About 6 months," I replied, continuing to tag clothes behind the counter. Harold nodded thoughtfully. "I used to deliver supplies to this place back in the 70s when the parents ran it. Good people." "They still come in sometimes," I said. "They seem nice." "Nicest folks you could hope to meet," Harold agreed. "Took over this place when nobody else wanted it. Had a bad reputation back then." My hand stilled over the shirt I was tagging. "What kind of reputation?" Harold leaned forward slightly. "Well, during Prohibition, this whole block was nothing but speakeasies and gambling dens. This building in particular had quite the history. Used to be what they called a blind pig, a place that sold illegal liquor. Had a secret entrance through the back and tunnels connecting to other establishments." I tried to keep my voice casual. "I've heard about the tunnels. Are they still down there?" "Some are," Harold said. "Most got filled in or sealed off over the years. But this building," he tapped his cane on the floor, "this one had more than just tunnels beneath it." "What do you mean?" Harold glanced around as though making sure we were still alone. "The owner back then, fellow named William Blackwood, he was into some dark business, not just liquor. They say he practiced occult rituals in the basement, strange symbols painted on the walls, animal sacrifices, that sort of thing. A chill ran through me as I remembered the bird-like prints on my windshield. When Prohibition ended," Harold continued, Blackwood disappeared. Some said he skipped town to avoid debtors. Others claimed he fell afoul of his occult practices. They never found him, but the building changed hands multiple times after that. Nobody kept it for long, always complained about strange happenings. What kind of happenings? I asked, though I already had a good idea. Things moving on their own, cold spots, noises coming from the basement when nobody was down there. Harold shrugged. The usual ghost stories. Most businesses only lasted a year or two before selling. Until the Winstons bought it, Richard and Joe's parents. They were the first to stay. Did they experience anything unusual? Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. You asking because you've seen something? I hesitated, then nodded. A few things. Nothing I can really explain. The old man nodded, unsurprised. The Winstons experienced it too, especially at first. Mrs. Winston told me once that they considered selling after just 3 months, but then something changed. What happened? They brought in a priest, had him bless the building, perform some kind of ritual. Things got better after that, not perfect, but better. The activity decreased, became less threatening. I thought about my own experiences, frightening but never directly harmful. More like a presence making itself known than actively trying to cause damage. The priest told them something interesting, Harold continued. Said the building wasn't haunted by a single entity, but by echoes, impressions left behind by strong emotions and events. Said the tunnel system beneath amplified these echoes, carried them between buildings like sound through pipes. The front door chimed as a customer entered. I excused myself to help them, processing their order quickly before returning to Harold. So what happened to the tunnels? I asked. Are they still accessible? Most were sealed off decades ago, Harold said, but sections remain, hidden beneath buildings throughout downtown. The entrance in this building, a grate in the back room if I remember correctly, it was one of the few left intact. Mr. Winston used it to access the plumbing. He paused. Have you been down there? I nodded reluctantly. Once, briefly. I thought I saw something in the tunnel. Harold didn't seem surprised. The echoes are strongest in the tunnels themselves. That's where it all happened. The illegal activities, Blackwood's rituals, who knows what else over the years. The priest warned the Winstons never to remove the barriers that had been placed in the tunnels. Barriers? Symbols carved into the brickwork at certain points, designed to contain whatever energies lingered there. Breaking them would allow those energies to flow freely again. I thought about the brief glimpse I'd had of the tunnel, the old bricks, the earthen floor. I hadn't noticed any symbols, but I hadn't gone far enough to see where the passage might have been blocked off. Richard's voice from the front of the store interrupted our conversation. Harold, good to see you. The elderly man stood smiling as Richard approached. Just stopping by to say hello. Been chatting with your young employee here. Richard glanced at me, then back at Harold. Telling old stories, I hope? Just reminiscing about the old days, Harold said with a wink in my direction. As the two men moved toward Richard's office, Harold turned back to me. Word of advice, whatever you saw down there, leave it be. Some things are better left undisturbed. I nodded, grateful for the warning I had already decided to heed. That evening, as I prepared to leave, with Joe still in the building, I looked at the washing room door with new understanding. The strange experiences, the presence I'd felt, the bird-like prints on my windshield, they were all connected to the building's dark history and whatever lingered in the tunnel system beneath. Harold's story had provided context for my experiences, turning nebulous fear into something I could comprehend, if not entirely explain. Knowledge hadn't eliminated the mystery, but it had made it manageable. Spring arrived slowly in Ogden, melting the snow and gradually warming the old brick building. My shifts at the dry cleaner continued without major incident, though I still occasionally felt watched when working near the washing room. The metal grate remained undisturbed. I made sure of that, giving it a wide berth whenever I had to enter that cold concrete space. Richard and Joe never mentioned Harold's visit or questioned what he might have told me. I wondered if they knew more than they let on about the building's history and its supernatural residents. Perhaps they had simply learned to coexist with the echoes, as Harold had called them, treating them as just another quirk of running a business in an old downtown building. As graduation approached, I began preparing to leave the job. I had been accepted to a university 2 states away and would be moving at the end of summer. Part of me was relieved to be leaving the dry cleaner and its mysteries behind. Another part, surprisingly, felt almost protective of the place and its secrets. In late April, about a month before I was set to graduate, I was closing with Richard when he brought up the subject I'd been avoiding. "Joe told me you went down through the grate a while back," he said casually as we were shutting down the equipment. I froze, unsure how to respond. I was curious. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have." Richard shook his head. "It's natural to be curious. Most people who work here long enough sense something different about this place." "Did you know about the tunnels?" I asked. "My parents told me and Joe when we were teenagers. Made us promise never to explore them." He sighed. "Of course, being kids, we did anyway." "What did you find?" Richard was quiet for a moment, seeming to debate how much to share. "Nothing concrete. Strange markings on the walls, cold spots that shouldn't have been there. Once we thought we heard footsteps following us, but when we turned around, no one was there." "Did you ever see anything?" I hesitated before adding, "In the tunnel, I thought I saw a figure." Richard nodded slowly. "Once, just a glimpse, like a tall shadow that moved wrong. That was enough for me. I sealed off our section of the tunnel after that. Bricked it up about 20 feet in from our access point. That explained why the passage I'd seen seemed to disappear into darkness. It likely ended at Richard's brick wall." "Why keep the access open at all?" I asked. "The plumbing," he replied simply. "Some of the main pipes run through that space. We need to be able to reach them for repairs." He paused. "But there's more to it. My parents consulted someone, a priest or psychic, I'm not sure exactly, who told them the grate itself serves as a kind of release valve." "Release valve?" "For the energy in the building. Keeping it completely sealed would cause pressure to build up, make the activity worse. The grate allows it to dissipate gradually, keeping things relatively peaceful." I thought about my experiences. Frightening, but never violent. More like reminders of a presence than actual threats. "What about the bird prints on my windshield?" I asked. "Do you know anything about those?" Richard looked surprised. "Bird prints?" I described the marks that had appeared that winter night, how they couldn't be removed no matter what I tried. He frowned. "I've never heard of anything like that. Most of the activity stays inside the building." He hesitated, though my father once mentioned something about the original owner, the one who ran the speakeasy, having an obsession with birds. Had a whole collection of taxidermied specimens in his office, according to local stories. Harold mentioned him. William Blackwood said he was into occult practices. Richard nodded. "That's the story. Nobody knows for sure what happened to him. The building stood empty for almost a year after he disappeared, then changed hands multiple times until my parents bought it." We finished closing in thoughtful silence. As we walked to the front door, Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've been a good employee," he said. "Reliable, hardworking, and you've handled the peculiarities of this place better than most. Some people quit within weeks because they can't stand the feeling of being watched." "I almost did," I admitted, "after that day with the overwhelming dread." Richard nodded in understanding. "We all have moments like that here. You learn to work around it, to respect the building's moods without letting them control you." As we stepped outside and he locked the door behind us, I looked back at the old building. In the fading light of evening, it looked unremarkable. Just another storefront in a row of similar structures. Nothing to suggest the secrets it held beneath its floors or the echoes that lingered in its walls. "Will you miss it?" Richard asked, following my gaze. "Parts of it," I replied honestly. "Not the washing room. Definitely not that great, but the rest, it grows on you, doesn't it?" Richard smiled. "That it does. This building has been in our family for almost 50 years now. whatever else it might be, it's home. My last few weeks at the dry cleaner passed uneventfully. As my final day approached, I found myself growing oddly sentimental about the old building and its peculiarities. The hiss of the steam presses, the chemical smell of the cleaning agents, even the perpetual chill of the washing room, they had become familiar, almost comforting in their constancy. On my final shift, Richard and Joe presented me with a card signed by all the employees and a modest bonus. For college, Joe said with a wink. As I prepared to leave for the last time, I found myself hesitating in the main room, looking toward the washing room door. "Go on," Richard said, noticing my glance. "Say goodbye if you want." Feeling slightly foolish but compelled nonetheless, I walked to the washing room and pushed open the door. The single bulb cast its weak light across the concrete floor and the metal grate that had dominated so many of my nightmares. "Goodbye," I said softly to the empty room. "Thanks for not hurting me, I guess." The light flickered once, a brief dimming and brightening that could have been coincidence or acknowledgement. A gentle coolness brushed past me, like someone walking by in a hurry, and then the room was still. I backed out, closing the door firmly behind me. Richard was waiting by the front entrance, keys in hand. "All set?" he asked. I nodded. "All set." As I walked to my car for the last time, the bird prints on my windshield caught the late afternoon sun, their outlines clear against the glass. They had become such a familiar sight that I barely noticed them anymore. Just another reminder of my time at the dry cleaner and the mysteries I would be leaving behind. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, watching the old building recede in my rearview mirror. Whatever haunted its walls and tunnels would continue long after I was gone. Echoes of the past that refused to fade completely, lingering in that space between reality and memory. I never returned to work at the dry cleaner, though I occasionally drove past the building when visiting home during college breaks. It remained unchanged, a constant in the evolving downtown landscape. Sometimes I wondered if new employees experienced the same phenomena I had: the moving objects, the overwhelming dread, the sense of being watched from the washing room. The bird print stayed on my windshield until the car finally died 3 years later, a permanent souvenir of my time there. Sometimes, especially on cold winter nights, I dream of that metal grate and what lies beneath it. The tunnel stretching into darkness, the shuffling sound approaching from the shadows, the figure I glimpsed but never fully saw. In those dreams, I'm always running, trying to escape back up the ladder before whatever dwells in the tunnel reaches me. I usually wake before I discover if I make it or not. Perhaps it's better that way. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors left closed. The dry cleaner in downtown Ogden holds its secrets still, echoes trapped in brick and mortar, waiting for someone else to hear them. But that someone isn't me. I've moved on, carrying only memories and the knowledge that some buildings are more than just buildings. They're vessels for the past, keepers of stories that refuse to end. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, they'll tell you those stories, whether you want to hear them or not. It was September 14th, 2018. At 14 years old, living in Belfast meant finding creative ways to occupy our evenings. Most nights, my friends and I ventured on short walks around our neighborhood, familiar territory that promised safety and predictability. But that Friday evening, we yearned for something different. The autumn air carried a hint of chill as I left my house at 1852, pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders. For privacy, I'll call my friends Katie and Ellie. Katie lived just 3 streets away, her house recognizable by the chipped blue paint on the front door. I knocked twice, our signal. "Ready for an adventure?" I asked when she appeared, her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Katie nodded, grabbing her small backpack. "Let's get Ellie." We walked in companionable silence to Ellie's house, our footsteps echoing on the concrete. The streetlights flickered on one by one as darkness began its slow descent. Ellie was waiting at her garden gate, bouncing on her heels with characteristic impatience. "Took you long enough," she said, but her smile betrayed her excitement. "I've got 20 pounds. Should be enough for bus fare and maybe a coffee somewhere nice. Our plan was simple, but thrilling in its deviation from routine. Take the bus to the university area where the cafes stayed open later, where students created an atmosphere of sophisticated freedom that we, as 14-year-olds, desperately wanted to sample. The bus stop near Ellie Street was deserted when we arrived. I checked my watch. 19:05. The evening stretched before us with the promise of adventure. Innocent enough for teenagers, yet a small act of independence that made us feel mature beyond our years. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, we climbed aboard with the confidence of frequent travelers, though our hearts raced with the small thrill of rebellion. None of us had told our parents exactly where we were going. They assumed we were at each other's houses, a half-truth that sat uncomfortably in my stomach. The bus wound through the familiar streets of our neighborhood before heading toward the university district. Through the window, I watched Belfast transform from residential familiarity to urban vibrancy. The buildings grew taller, the streets busier. Students moved in groups, laughing and talking, embodying a freedom we could only imagine. "This was a brilliant idea," Katie whispered, her eyes reflecting the passing streetlights. "We should do this more often." I nodded, but something in me hesitated, an instinctive wariness I couldn't explain. Looking back, I wonder if some part of me sensed what the night would bring. We arrived at the university area at 1921, stepping off the bus into a street lined with cafes and restaurants. The lights from these establishments spilled onto the pavement, creating pools of warmth in the deepening evening. Students sat at outdoor tables despite the cooling air, their conversations creating a background hum that felt sophisticated and adult. "Where should we go?" Ellie asked, surveying the options with obvious delight. We wandered along the street, peering into windows of cafes that looked either too expensive or too intimidating for three 14-year-olds. Each establishment seemed to silently question our presence, and I felt increasingly self-conscious in my school shoes and practical jacket. "Nothing feels right," Katie said after our third loop of the same block. "Let's head to the city center instead. More options there." The city center was a 15-minute walk away, a distance that seemed insignificant in our quest for the perfect evening. We set off with determined strides, following the well-lit main road that connected the university district to the commercial heart of Belfast. The walk took us past historic buildings whose details were lost in the growing darkness, their facades looming above us in silent judgment. Few people walked this stretch at this hour. Most took buses or taxis, and the relative emptiness of the street made our footsteps sound unnaturally loud. "There's something about being out at night," Ellie said, her voice low as if sharing a secret. "Everything feels different, more significant." Her words sent an involuntary shiver through me. The darkness around us suddenly seemed deeper, the spaces between streetlights longer. We reached the city center at 1945, the street now bustling with evening crowds heading to restaurants and cinemas. After another 10 minutes of indecision, we finally found a cafe that seemed welcoming enough, its prices reasonable, its clientele diverse enough that three teenagers wouldn't stand out. Inside, the warmth and light restored our spirits. We ordered hot chocolates and shared a plate of chips, luxuriating in this small taste of independence. Through the window, I noticed the sky had darkened completely, and the first drops of rain began to strike the glass. "We should head back soon," I said, checking my watch. It was now 20:05, and my parents expected me home by 21:30. "It's starting to rain." Katie nodded, reluctantly abandoning the last of her hot chocolate. "Let's catch the bus back to our area." We paid and stepped outside, immediately buffeted by a wind that hadn't been present before. The rain was light but persistent, promising to intensify as the evening progressed. We hurried to the nearest bus stop, huddling beneath its inadequate shelter as we waited for the number 27 bus that would take us all home. The bus arrived at 20:15, its interior a haven of dry warmth. We climbed aboard, shaking raindrops from our jackets, and took seats near the back. The bus was half empty, typical for a Friday evening when most people were either already at their destinations or taking taxis home. Our relief was short-lived. At the second stop, a man in a dark uniform boarded. The ticket inspector's presence sent an immediate ripple of tension through us. None of us had bought tickets, having spent our limited funds on hot chocolates and the fare to the city. He moved methodically through the bus, checking each passenger's ticket. When he reached us, his expression hardened at our stuttered explanations. "Off. Next stop," he said firmly, brooking no argument. At 1950, we found ourselves standing at an unfamiliar bus stop as the number 27 pulled away. The rain had intensified, falling in a steady curtain that quickly penetrated our inadequate jackets. Around us, the streets were unfamiliar, a commercial area transitioning to residential, with fewer people and dimmer lighting than the city center. "Great," Ellie muttered, pulling her hood tighter around her face. "Now what?" Katie, always practical, pointed down the street. "There's another bus stop about 5 minutes that way. We can check the schedule, find another bus that goes near our area." We walked huddled together, partly for warmth and partly from a growing sense of unease. This part of Belfast was unfamiliar, the buildings more industrial than residential. Few people walked the streets, and those who did moved with purpose, heads down against the rain. The next bus stop offered little hope. The next bus that would take us anywhere near our neighborhood wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes in the increasing rain seemed an eternity. "I know a shortcut," I said suddenly, remembering the geography of our city. "If we take the number 14 bus to Oak Hill Road, we can cut through the forest behind the football field. That puts us about 10 minutes from home." The forest I referred to was a familiar place during daylight hours. All summer long we had explored its paths, climbing trees and building temporary shelters from fallen branches. In daylight, it was our kingdom, a place of adventure and imagination. Through the forest? At night? Katie sounded skeptical, but the rain streaming down her face made the alternative equally unappealing. "It's not even 9 o'clock, I reasoned. "And we all know that forest backward and forward. It'll take 15 minutes, tops, to cut through." The decision was made more by circumstance than actual agreement. When the number 14 bus arrived at 2016, we boarded without further discussion, silently acknowledging that getting home quickly outweighed any reservations about our route. As we traveled, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the bus with increasing force. Through the fogged windows, Belfast became a blur of streetlights and neon signs. The bus gradually emptied as it moved away from the city center, until we were the only passengers remaining. The final stop was at the edge of a strongly Protestant neighborhood, a fact that added an extra layer of tension to our situation. Belfast's sectarian divisions might seem incomprehensible to outsiders, but for us, they were lived reality. Katie and I both had distinctively Catholic names, and while violence had largely subsided in recent years, old prejudices lingered. "Keep your voices down," I whispered as we stepped off the bus at 2040. "Let's just get through here quickly." We walked briskly through quiet residential streets, past houses where televisions flickered behind curtains. The rain created a natural sound barrier, masking our footsteps and hushed conversation. No one looked at us twice, just 3 teenagers hurrying home in the rain. The football field appeared ahead, a vast expanse of sodden grass bordered on one side by the forest that would lead us home. Streetlights ended at the field's edge, and beyond it, the forest loomed as a wall of absolute darkness. "This was a mistake," Katie said, stopping at the field's edge. "We should go back, find another bus." I checked my watch, 20:55. "Going back means at least another hour before we get home. We'll all be grounded for weeks." Ellie took a deep breath. "Let's just go. The faster we start, the faster we're through." We crossed the field at a run, our shoes squelching in waterlogged grass. The rain fell in sheets now, driven by a wind that seemed to target any exposed skin with icy precision. By the time we reached the forest's edge, we were thoroughly soaked, our clothes heavy with water. I pulled out my phone and activated its flashlight. Katie and Ellie did the same, creating 3 weak beams that barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The forest, so familiar in daylight, had transformed into something alien and unwelcoming. "It's a straight path for about 2 minutes," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Then there are 2 fence posts. We turn right there, walk for another 2 minutes, and we're out on the other side." We entered the forest in single file, with me leading the way. The canopy provided some shelter from the rain, but water still dripped from leaves and branches, falling in heavy drops that found their way past collars and sleeves. The ground beneath our feet had turned to mud, making each step treacherous. The beam from my phone illuminated only a few feet ahead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying branches. The familiar sounds of the forest were amplified by darkness, the creak of trees, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. "It feels different at night," Ellie whispered from behind me. "Like it's watching us." I wanted to dismiss her comment as childish imagination, but I couldn't. The forest did feel different, hostile rather than welcoming, as if our presence was an intrusion it would not tolerate. We walked for what felt like 5 minutes, but the 2 fence posts that should have marked our turning point were nowhere in sight. The straight path we had followed countless times in summer seemed to curve now, leading us deeper into the forest rather than through it. "We should have reached the posts by now," Katie said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Are you sure this is the right path?" "Positive," I replied, though doubt had begun to creep in. "Maybe it just feels longer because of the dark and the rain." We continued forward, our phone lights creating a small bubble of visibility in the pressing darkness. The rain intensified again, drumming against the canopy above and finding its way through in cold, persistent streams. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made conversation difficult and orientation nearly impossible. After another 5 minutes of walking, I stopped abruptly. "This isn't right. We should have reached the fence posts by now." We huddled together, 3 beams of light pointing in different directions, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth that looked identical in every direction. "Let's go back," Ellie suggested, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Find the entrance again and start over." We turned and began retracing our steps, or what we thought were our steps. The mud had already filled in our footprints, leaving no trail to follow. After 10 minutes of walking, we should have reached the edge of the forest, but trees still surrounded us on all sides. "This is impossible," Katie said, stopping abruptly. "We know this forest. We've spent every day here this summer. How can we be lost?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and terrifying in its implications. The forest we knew so intimately had somehow transformed, becoming an unfamiliar labyrinth of identical trees and misleading paths. "Let's try going uphill," I suggested, remembering that the forest sloped gently upward toward its center. "If we reach higher ground, maybe we can see the edge." We changed direction, laboriously climbing a slight incline made treacherous by mud and exposed roots. The rain seemed to intensify with our efforts, as if deliberately opposing our progress. Our breathing grew heavy, visible in the cold air as small clouds that dissipated instantly. After a grueling climb, we reached what appeared to be the forest's highest point. A massive oak tree stood there, its trunk wider than the 3 of us could reach around, its branches extending outward like the spokes of an enormous wheel. "I've never seen this tree before," Katie whispered, her face pale in the harsh light of her phone. "Never." Neither had I, which was impossible. We had explored every inch of this forest, claimed it as our own private territory. A tree this size couldn't have escaped our notice. Yet here it stood, ancient and imposing, a silent sentinel that seemed to mock our confusion. As we stood beneath the enormous oak, trying to reconcile its existence with our knowledge of the forest, Katie's phone flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then steady again. "Battery must be getting low," she said, but her voice held doubt. Her phone had been fully charged when we left. My flashlight went next, blinking rapidly before extinguishing completely. I checked my phone. 72% battery remaining. No reason for the light to fail. "What's happening?" Ellie's voice trembled, her own light now the only illumination we had. Before I could answer, Katie's phone rang, the sound shockingly loud in the forest's hushed atmosphere. She fumbled with it, almost dropping it in the mud before answering. "Hello?" Her voice echoed strangely. "Joanne, is that you?" Joanne was Ellie's twin sister who had stayed home with a cold that evening. Katie's face grew increasingly puzzled as she listened, then alarmed. "Joanne, I can barely hear you. What do you mean? Where are—" The call ended abruptly. Katie stared at her phone in confusion. It just hung up, and now it's dead. She showed us the black screen. It was at 65% a minute ago. A sense of wrongness permeated the air around us, as tangible as the rain that continued to fall. The forest felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with the trees and animals that inhabited it, a sentient presence that observed us with cold curiosity. "Let's keep moving," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Downhill has to lead out eventually." We descended from the great oak, moving slowly with only Ellie's phone light to guide us. The beam seemed weaker now, as if the darkness was actively consuming it rather than being repelled. The rain created a constant soundtrack to our journey, but beneath it, I began to notice other sounds. Subtle movements that stopped whenever we paused to listen. The crack of a twig behind us. The rustle of leaves where no wind blew. The sensation of being followed intensified with each step. "Do you hear that?" I whispered after a particularly loud snap from somewhere to our left. Katie and Ellie nodded, their eyes wide with fear. We stood motionless, straining to detect any movement in the darkness that surrounded us. For a full minute, nothing moved. Then, just as we prepared to continue, a branch cracked directly behind us. We ran. Blind panic propelled us forward, our feet slipping in mud, branches whipping against our faces and arms. Ellie's phone light bounced wildly, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow that made navigation impossible. We weren't following a path now, just running, driven by primal fear. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch and contract, minutes feeling like hours as we fled from whatever stalked us through the dark forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving long past the point of exhaustion. Then, suddenly, the trees thinned. We burst into a clearing. Not the football field we had expected, but a small meadow I had never seen before. The rain fell unimpeded here, soaking us anew, but the open space felt like salvation after the suffocating confines of the forest. We stopped, bending double as we gasped for breath. The relative safety of the clearing allowed rational thought to return, and with it came questions. Where were we? How had we become so thoroughly lost in a forest we knew intimately? What had been following us? "We need to figure out where we are," I said when I could speak again. "This clearing, has anyone seen it before?" Katie and Ellie shook their heads, their faces ghostly in the diminishing light of Ellie's phone. "I thought I knew every inch of these woods," Ellie said, "but nothing looks familiar anymore." We stood in the center of the clearing, rain plastering our hair to our scalps, our clothes heavy and sodden. Around us, the forest formed a dark perimeter, trees swaying slightly in a wind we couldn't feel. The sensation of being watched persisted, stronger now, as if our observer had followed us into the clearing. "Listen," Katie whispered. Above the steady drumming of rain, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the clearing's edge, just within the tree line. Not approaching, but not retreating either. Just circling, methodically, as if measuring the dimensions of our temporary sanctuary. "We need to leave. Now," I said, grabbing both their arms. "Across the clearing, away from whatever that is." We moved as one, splashing through puddles that reflected the clouded night sky above. The footsteps continued their measured circuit, neither accelerating nor changing course in response to our movement. At the clearing's far edge, we found what appeared to be a well-worn path leading downhill. Without discussion, we took it, moving as quickly as the slippery conditions allowed. Behind us, the footsteps stopped, a silence more terrifying than their steady progression had been. The path descended steeply, forcing us to half-run, half-slide down its length. Trees flashed past, their wet trunks gleaming in Ellie's fading light. The rain seemed to ease slightly, allowing sounds of civilization to reach us. Distant traffic, the faint call of someone's voice. After another 5 minutes of descent, the path widened. Ahead, streetlights became visible through the thinning trees. We increased our pace, drawn to the promise of safety they represented. And then, without warning, We were out. The forest ended abruptly at the edge of a playing field I recognized, not the football field where we had entered, but a smaller pitch near our neighborhood's edge. Across it, streets of houses stretched toward home. We crossed the field in silence, too exhausted and shocked for conversation. Only when we reached the street did I think to check the time. 20:45. That can't be right, I said, showing them my phone. We entered the forest after 8:30. We were in there for at least an hour. Katie checked her phone, which had mysteriously regained power once we left the forest. Mine says the same, 8:45. But that's impossible, Ellie protested. We were in there for ages, hours maybe. We stood beneath a streetlight, rain still falling around us, trying to reconcile our experience with objective reality. 6 minutes. According to our phones, our entire ordeal had lasted only 6 minutes. I need to get home, Katie said finally, her voice hollow with exhaustion. I can't think about this anymore tonight. We separated at the next corner, each heading to our respective homes. I walked mechanically, my mind replaying fragments of our experience, the enormous oak that shouldn't exist, the sounds of pursuit, the inexplicable time distortion. My parents barely noticed my sodden state when I arrived home, assuming I'd been caught in the rain on a normal evening walk. I mumbled something about being tired and retreated to my room, where I peeled off wet clothes with trembling hands. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the forest, not as it had always been, but as it had revealed itself to be. A place where familiar rules didn't apply, where something watched from the shadows with patient malevolence. The next morning, I messaged Katie and Ellie. We met at my house, gathered in my bedroom with the door firmly closed. In daylight, surrounded by normal things, our experience seemed almost dreamlike, a shared hallucination born of darkness and fear. I've been thinking, Katie said, her face still pale with remembered terror. What if it wasn't the same forest? What do you mean? I asked. Of course it was the same forest. Was it, though? Nothing was where it should have been. Paths went in wrong directions. That huge oak tree, none of us had ever seen it before. What if, somehow, we entered a different place entirely? The suggestion should have been absurd, but after what we'd experienced, it carried a terrible logic. The forest we entered was not the forest we knew, despite occupying the same physical space. Whatever happened, Ellie said firmly, we're never going back there after dark. Never. We made a pact that day, sworn with the solemn intensity only teenagers can muster. We would never enter the forest at night again. We would never speak of our experience to others who wouldn't understand or believe us. 3 years have passed since that night. I've entered the forest many times since then, always in broad daylight, always with multiple friends. In daylight, it's exactly as it's always been. Familiar paths, recognizable landmarks, no enormous oak tree on any hill. But sometimes, standing at its edge as the sun begins to set, I hear it calling. The forest at night is a different place. A place where time bends and reality shifts. Where something waits in patient silence for unwary travelers. And on rainy nights when wind drives water against my window, I remember the sound of footsteps circling in the darkness, measuring the dimensions of our fear with methodical precision. I don't go for night walks anymore. Some places are different after dark, not just in appearance or atmosphere, but in their fundamental nature. The forest taught me that. Whatever walked its paths that night is still there, waiting for someone else to take a shortcut through the trees after the sun goes down. Every year, I mark 3 weekends on my calendar in bright red, my sacred escapes to the mountains of northern Georgia. As a 29-year-old construction manager from Jacksonville, these solitary retreats had become my salvation from the constant noise of machinery, phones, and people. By April 2020, I needed this getaway more than ever. The pandemic had upended my routine, turning work into an endless cycle of delays and safety protocols. My apartment walls were closing in after weeks of limited social contact. The mountains promised space to breathe, to think, to reset. I'd inherited my love for the outdoors from my grandfather. He taught me to fish when I was 7, showed me how to build a fire at 9, and by 12, I could identify most edible plants in the southeastern wilderness. Before he passed, he'd gifted me his cherished hunting knife, a weathered blade with a worn leather handle that never left my pack. Nature demands respect, he'd tell me. She gives plenty but takes just as much if you're not careful. I should have remembered his warnings more clearly. My German Shepherd, Buddy, sensed my excitement as I began packing on Wednesday night. 4 years old and fiercely loyal, he shadowed me through the apartment, his tail wagging whenever I gathered camping equipment. He'd been my companion on these trips since he was a pup, unfazed by wildlife, protective when necessary. I meticulously checked my gear list: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, fishing equipment, preserved food, cooking supplies, extra clothes, flashlights, batteries, maps. Everything organized in waterproof containers, a system refined through years of experience. I'd chosen a more remote area this time, somewhere I hadn't explored before, discovered through an obscure hiking forum online. That night, I dreamed of pine forests and mountain streams. I didn't know these pleasant visions would be my last peaceful sleep for months. Friday morning arrived with perfect clarity. The April air felt crisp as I loaded my truck before sunrise, Buddy prancing around the vehicle, understanding exactly what was happening. I secured the last container, double-checked the apartment, and we were on the road by 6:15 a.m. The interstate stretched ahead, gradually emptying of commuter traffic as we pushed north. My phone played my favorite playlist through the speakers, classic rock that my father had introduced me to decades ago. Buddy dozed in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting his head when I sang particularly off-key. We crossed into Georgia around 9:30, stopping at a small gas station where the elderly attendant warned about incoming weather. "Storm system's moving in Sunday evening," he said, eyeing my camping gear. "Not supposed to hit hard, but mountain weather don't always follow forecasts." I thanked him, bought beef jerky and coffee, and continued north. The 2-lane highway gradually narrowed as it wound into increasingly dense forest. The elevation climbed steadily, roads curved more sharply, and cell service became spotty. By 11:45, I was deep in mountain country, following my planned route when I noticed an unmarked gravel turnoff I hadn't seen on previous trips. A weathered wooden sign, partially obscured by branches, read, "Cascade Valley, 16 miles. I slowed, consulting my map. This road wasn't marked, but seemed to curve in the general direction I was heading. "What do you think, boy? Should we explore?" I asked Buddy, who perked up at being addressed. My normal cautious nature would have kept me on the known path, but something about this road pulled at me. Perhaps the challenge of new terrain, perhaps simple curiosity. I made the turn, gravel crunching under tires as we ventured onto the unfamiliar route. The road narrowed quickly, dense forest pressing in from both sides. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in irregular patterns, casting strange shadows across the windshield. At first I maintained mental notes of our direction, but the road twisted so frequently I eventually lost my bearings. Transmission of radio stations had faded to static long ago. The silence of the forest became a presence itself, broken only by the engine and occasional birdsong. I glanced at my watch. We'd been on this road for nearly an hour, much longer than I'd intended. "We should be connecting back to the main road soon," I told Buddy, who watched the passing trees with unusual intensity. The first unsettling moment came when I noticed the birds had stopped singing. Their absence created a vacuum of sound that pressed against my eardrums. Even Buddy sensed the change, his ears pivoting to catch any noise. When I finally spotted a small clearing suitable for camping, the sun was already dipping toward the western ridge. I'd lost track of time, and with it, any real understanding of where exactly we were. The clearing measured perhaps 50 feet across, ringed by towering pines and thick undergrowth. A small stream burbled nearby, perfect for fishing and water supply. I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and began unloading while Buddy investigated the perimeter, nose to the ground. Something felt off immediately. Normally, Buddy would range widely, exploring with enthusiasm. Today he stayed within 20 feet of me, returning frequently as if checking my presence. His behavior was subtle enough that I initially attributed it to the unfamiliar location. I erected my tent with practiced efficiency, gathered firewood, and established a cooking area. The mundane routine of setting up camp normally brought comfort, but as shadows lengthened across the clearing, I found myself frequently pausing to listen. The forest was too quiet. In springtime, Georgia mountains, certain sounds should be constants. Birds calling, insects humming, small animals rustling in underbrush. Instead, a weighted silence hung between the trees, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through branches. "Just means we have the place to ourselves," I told Buddy as I finished securing the tent. As dusk approached, I prepared a simple dinner over the campfire: beans, canned meat, and instant coffee. The flames pushed back the growing darkness but couldn't dispel my increasing unease. Buddy refused to settle, pacing the perimeter of our camp, stopping occasionally to stare into the darkening trees. While washing dishes in the stream, I noticed something odd. No fish darted away from my hands. No frogs jumped from the banks. Water this clean should have teemed with life. Instead, it flowed crystal clear and empty. "We'll explore properly tomorrow," I promised Buddy, who had followed me to the water. "Get the lay of the land in daylight." That's when I noticed a narrow trail leading into the forest opposite our camp. Barely visible in the fading light, it appeared man-made, too straight and even to be a game path. The discovery should have been reassuring evidence of human presence, but something about its placement, hidden among dense undergrowth yet clearly maintained, raised the hairs on my neck. Night fell completely as I secured our food in the truck. The darkness in these remote mountains was absolute, with no light pollution to soften the black void between trees. My headlamp carved a weak tunnel through the darkness as I prepared for bed. Inside the tent, Buddy pressed against me instead of sprawling in his usual sleeping position. His body felt tense, muscles twitching occasionally as he listened to sounds I couldn't hear. Sleep came reluctantly, in shallow bursts interrupted by Buddy's soft whines and my own straining ears, trying to identify what had disturbed him. At some point near midnight, we both jolted awake at the same moment. Something had snapped a branch nearby, too heavy to be a small animal. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding. Buddy's growl vibrated against my side, low and warning. I held my breath, listening. Nothing but silence followed. After 5 agonizing minutes, Buddy relaxed slightly, and I convinced myself it was probably a deer. Still, I kept the flashlight within reach for the remainder of the night. Dawn arrived with welcome normalcy. Birdsong returned with the light, dispelling some of my nocturnal anxiety. I emerged from the tent to find dew coating every surface and mist hanging between the trees. The morning sun transformed the forest into something beautiful, rather than threatening. After breakfast, I decided to investigate the trail I'd spotted the previous evening. With daylight and a full night's rest, however interrupted, my concern seemed overblown. Buddy appeared more himself as well, though he stayed unusually close as I prepared for our hike. "Let's see where this goes," I said, securing my day pack with water, snacks, first aid supplies, and a detailed topographical map of the region. I clipped Buddy's leash to his collar, something I rarely needed to do in the wilderness, and set off down the narrow path. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their canopy filtering sunlight into occasional dappled patches on the forest floor. Though I considered myself reasonably well-versed in local geography, nothing about this area seemed familiar. Approximately 20 minutes into our hike, I noticed the return of that unsettling silence. The birds that had greeted the morning were now absent. Even the sound of wind through leaves had diminished, as though the forest held its breath. Buddy noticed too, his ears constantly moving, nose working overtime. The trail descended gradually toward what sounded like moving water. After another 10 minutes, we emerged at a small creek cutting through a rocky ravine. Clear water tumbled over moss-covered stones, creating the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. I consulted my map, trying to identify which watershed we might be in, but found nothing that matched our surroundings. This realization was more unsettling than I wanted to admit. I prided myself on wilderness navigation. "Let's rest here a bit," I told Buddy, finding a flat rock beside the stream. As I refilled my water bottle through my purification filter, I noticed something unusual downstream. A series of stones arranged too precisely to be natural. Curious, I walked closer, Buddy reluctantly following. What I'd spotted was unmistakably human-made. 7 smooth stones arranged in a perfect circle, with an 8th larger stone placed in the center. The arrangement seemed ritualistic, though I couldn't imagine its purpose. More disturbing was the realization that this meant someone else frequented this supposedly remote area. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent forest. "Anyone around?" My words seemed to drop into the silence like stones into still water, creating momentary ripples that quickly disappeared. No response came. Buddy suddenly stiffened, his attention locked on something across the stream. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual among the dense trees. Still, his behavior was concerning. His body trembled slightly, a reaction I'd never witnessed before. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the forest line. That's when I noticed what had caught his attention. Not a movement or shape, but a strange absence. Beyond the creek, in a rough semicircle perhaps 30 feet wide, nothing grew. No underbrush, no saplings, no ferns. Just bare earth between established trees, as though something had prevented all new growth. A chill ran through me despite the warming day. We'd ventured far enough. I tugged gently on Buddy's leash, turning back toward camp. "Come on, let's head back." Throughout our return journey, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every few minutes I'd stop and scan our surroundings, finding nothing but still trees and silence. Buddy remained tense, occasionally looking back the way we'd come. We reached camp by early afternoon, and I busied myself with gathering more firewood and preparing an early dinner, trying to rationalize my unease. Remote forests always felt eerie to those unaccustomed to true wilderness. The strange stone arrangement was probably left by hikers or local teenagers. The bare patch could be explained by soil composition or runoff patterns. But as evening approached, bringing with it long shadows and deepening silence, these rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. Darkness fell earlier than expected as clouds rolled in, obscuring the sunset. I built the campfire higher than necessary, the flames providing both warmth and psychological comfort against the encroaching night. Buddy refused to settle, alternating between pressing against my leg and pacing the perimeter of our camp, his attention repeatedly drawn to the trail we'd explored earlier. My initial plan had been to stay 3 nights, but I found myself considering a morning departure. The persistent silence, Buddy's uncharacteristic behavior, and my own growing discomfort made the prospect of another night increasingly unappealing. Around 9:30 p.m., as I was securing our food supplies in the truck, I heard something that froze me in place. A soft, methodical sound from the direction of the trail. Footsteps, too measured to be an animal, too heavy to be anything small. Buddy's reaction confirmed my fear. He didn't bark or growl as he typically would at an approaching stranger. Instead, he backed toward me, body low, a high whine escaping his throat. I reached for my flashlight, trying to control my breathing. "Hello?" I called again, directing my light toward the trail opening. "I'm armed," I added, though my only weapon was my grandfather's hunting knife. No response came, but the footsteps stopped. For several minutes I stood motionless, flashlight beam unwavering, ears straining. Nothing moved, nothing sounded. Even the crackling fire seemed muted. "Probably a deer," I told Buddy, trying to convince myself. "Let's get some sleep." I added more wood to the fire, creating a blaze that would last hours, and retreated to the tent. Inside, I positioned myself to view the entrance, knife within reach. Buddy pressed against me, trembling slightly. Sleep was impossible. Each crack of the fire, each whisper of wind became amplified in my hypervigilant state. Hours passed in this suspended anxiety, my eyes burning from staring into the darkness beyond the tent flap. Just after midnight, by my watch's illuminated dial, Buddy suddenly raised his head. His entire body tensed, and a low growl formed in his chest. Then I heard it, The footsteps had returned, closer now, circling our camp with deliberate slowness. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice higher than normal. "I can hear you. Show yourself." The footsteps stopped directly opposite our tent, perhaps 20 feet away at the forest's edge. I unzipped the tent with shaking hands and stepped out, Buddy reluctantly following. The fire had burned lower but still cast enough light to illuminate the clearing. I swept my flashlight beam along the tree line, seeing nothing at first. Then, raising the beam slightly higher, I caught reflection. 2 eyes shining back, positioned much higher than a human's should be. The beam revealed only those eyes, the rest of the figure obscured by shadow and foliage. But those eyes, too large, too round, reflecting green in my light, belonged to nothing I recognized. A rational part of my mind suggested a bear standing on hind legs, but the positioning was wrong. This stood fully upright, at least 7 feet tall, unmoving. Buddy, my fearless protector who'd faced down bears and wild boars without hesitation, made a sound I'd never heard before, half whimper, half moan, and pressed against my leg so hard I nearly lost balance. Warm liquid splashed my pants as his bladder released in terror. The standoff lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then the figure shifted slightly, branches moving around it. What happened next permanently altered my relationship with the wilderness. The creature, for I could no longer pretend it was human, emitted a sound that defied description. It began as something like a whistle, rising rapidly in pitch until it transformed into a scream that contained too many tones simultaneously, as though multiple throats produced it in unison. The sound physically impacted me, vibrating in my chest cavity and scrambling my thoughts. My flashlight beam wavered as intense primordial fear flooded my system. In that moment of absolute terror, the creature took one step forward, partially emerging from the tree line. My light caught a glimpse of something tall and gaunt, with proportions not quite right. Limbs too long, joints positioned unnaturally. Its skin appeared textured oddly, neither fur nor smooth flesh. Self-preservation finally overrode paralysis. I backed toward the truck, Buddy already retreating. The creature emitted that impossible sound again, and I ran. I've never packed camp so quickly. With adrenaline surging through my system, I abandoned any equipment that wouldn't fit in the first frantic sweep. The cooking gear, camp chair, and half the firewood stayed behind. Buddy jumped into the truck the moment I opened the door, scrambling across to the passenger seat. My hands shook so violently I dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. Headlights illuminated nothing unusual in the clearing. No tall figure, no glowing eyes, but the reassurance was minimal. I reversed sharply, then swung the truck around toward the gravel road. As we pulled away, I caught a final glimpse in the rearview mirror. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, moving at the edge of the headlight's reach. The truck bounced violently over the uneven road as I pushed well beyond a safe speed for the conditions. Branches scraped against the windows, and twice I nearly lost control on sharp curves. Buddy remained uncharacteristically silent, pressed against the passenger door, eyes fixed on the darkness behind us. After several miles at this reckless pace, rational thought began to return. I slowed slightly, realizing a crash in this remote area would leave us in a worse situation. My breath came in ragged gasps, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's okay," I said repeatedly, unsure whether I was addressing Buddy or myself. "We're putting distance between us. It's okay." The gravel road seemed far longer on the return journey. Every shadow between trees became a lurking threat, every unusual sound from the engine a potential breakdown. When we finally reached the paved highway, the relief was overwhelming. I didn't stop driving until we reached a 24-hour gas station nearly 2 hours later, its fluorescent lighting and human attendant representing safety. I never thought I'd associate with such an ordinary place. Parking under the brightest light, I finally allowed myself to process what had happened. My hands trembled as I reached for my water bottle. Buddy remained unnaturally subdued, watching me with concerned eyes. "What did we see?" I whispered, knowing he couldn't answer. The gas station attendant approached, concern evident as he took in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "You all right, mister? Looks like you've had a rough night." I mumbled something about getting lost and deciding to drive out rather than stay another night. He nodded sympathetically, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe my abbreviated story. Mountains can get to people sometimes, he offered, especially if you're not used to being alone out there. I nodded, grateful for the explanation that preserved my dignity, if not the truth. After refueling and purchasing terrible coffee, I continued driving through the night, unwilling to stop until reaching home. By the time we arrived at my apartment as dawn broke, exhaustion had replaced fear, leaving a hollow emptiness behind. The following weeks passed in a fog of sleepless nights and distracted days. Work provided temporary distraction, but nights brought the memory of those eyes, that sound, rushing back with paralyzing clarity. Buddy's behavior changed too. He startled at ordinary noises, refused walks after sunset, and often woke whimpering from whatever dogs experience as nightmares. I became obsessed with finding an explanation. My search history filled with phrases like unexplained encounters Georgia mountains, tall creatures southeastern wilderness, and strange sounds forest night. Most results led to obvious hoaxes, paranormal websites of questionable reliability, or folklore collections. The rational explanations, a bear, an unusually tall human, a combination of wildlife sounds distorted by terrain, felt increasingly inadequate against the visceral memory of what we'd experienced. 3 weeks after returning, I found myself sitting in a small public library 2 counties over, where I'd driven specifically to avoid using my home computer or local facilities. Something about my search felt private, almost shameful, as though admitting the encounter made me somehow less rational. The elderly librarian noticed my stack of local history books and regional wildlife guides. "Research project?" she asked kindly. I hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. I had an unusual experience camping in North Georgia, trying to make sense of it. She adjusted her glasses, studying me with unexpected intensity. "Whereabouts?" "Off an unmarked road near Cascade Valley," I replied. Something flickered across her expression, recognition, perhaps concern. "Not many folks camp out that way anymore," she said carefully. The "anymore" caught my attention immediately. "Why's that?" She seemed to debate internally before responding. "Local history is complicated. That valley has stories going back generations. Native tribes avoided it before European settlement. Later, logging operations reported difficulties." "What kind of difficulties?" I pressed. "Missing workers, equipment failures, unusual sounds." She shrugged slightly. "Could be ordinary explanations for everything, of course. Poor safety standards back then, wildlife, acoustics of the valley carrying sounds strangely." She returned to shelving books but added over her shoulder, "If you're interested in local history, there's a retired Forest Service ranger who knows more than anyone. Lives just outside town." By afternoon, I was sitting in the modest living room of Gerald Wilson, 78, former U.S. Forest Service ranger, with 42 years of experience in the region. His weathered face and direct gaze suggested a man unaccustomed to exaggeration. When I described my experience, excluding nothing, he listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. He showed neither disbelief nor surprise. "Seen it twice in my career," he said finally. "First time 1976, second 1992. Others reported similar over the decades." "What is it?" I asked, desperate for definition. "Don't know," he answered simply. "Neither does anyone else who's encountered it. Not for lack of trying." He poured coffee from a thermos, hands steady despite his age. "Here's what we do know. It stays within roughly 40 square miles of territory. Never approaches populated areas. Seems most active during spring and fall. Beyond that," he shrugged. "Official reports get filed, then buried. Why isn't this common knowledge? Why aren't there warnings?" He smiled thinly. "Who'd believe it? Besides, that area has no official trails, no campgrounds. Technically public land, but unmarked, undeveloped. Keeps most people away naturally." As darkness approached, he walked me to my truck. His parting words stayed with me. "Some places in this world exist at edges we don't understand. Best response is simple respect. Acknowledge their existence, then stay away. It's been nearly 3 years since that night in the Georgia mountains. I've never returned to that region, though I've resumed camping elsewhere after an 18-month hiatus. Buddy accompanies me still, though he remains unusually vigilant after dark. The experience altered me in subtle but permanent ways. I researched extensively, corresponding discreetly with others who reported similar encounters across the Appalachian Range. Some accounts aligned closely with mine. Others diverged in significant details. The common thread was the profound psychological impact. The certainty that conventional understanding of our world contains significant gaps. I've considered many explanations. Undiscovered species, psychological phenomena triggered by environmental factors, even the more esoteric possibilities I once would have dismissed outright. None fully satisfy, none completely fail. The mystery itself has become something I've learned to accommodate rather than resolve. What remains most vivid isn't the visual memory of those eyes or the shadowed figure, but the sound, that impossible multi-toned scream that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly within my chest cavity. In unguarded moments, I sometimes think I hear echoes of it, carried on the wind or hidden within ordinary noises. Last month, I received an unmarked envelope containing newspaper clippings from 1937. Reports of 3 missing loggers in northern Georgia, last seen near Cascade Valley. Their equipment was found abandoned beside a half-cleared camp. The search was abandoned after 5 days. No suspects were ever identified. No note accompanied the clippings. The postmark showed the small town where I'd met the librarian and former ranger. I still camp, still find peace in forests and mountains, but with greater caution now. I research areas thoroughly, stick to established trails, and rarely travel alone, except for Buddy's company. I've become more attuned to the natural rhythms of wilderness, aware that when those rhythms suddenly cease, it signals something significant. The world contains corners where unknown things persist, despite our maps, technologies, and certainties. My grandfather understood this when he warned that nature demands respect. What I encountered wasn't supernatural. It exists within our natural world, just beyond the boundaries of our documented understanding. I've made peace with uncertainty, with knowing that complete explanation may never come. But I remain absolutely certain of one thing. In the remote mountains of northern Georgia, in a valley unmarked on most maps, something watches from the trees. And when night falls, it moves with purpose through its territory, announcing its presence with a sound like nothing else on earth. To this day, I cannot hear true silence without remembering what broke it.